Hey everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. When British Prime Minister Keir Starmer visited China recently, both sides were quick to describe the trip as a success. Official statements emphasized improved dialogue, new business opportunities, and a renewed commitment to long-term cooperation. On the surface, it sounded like a diplomatic win, especially at a time when global tensions are high and communication between major powers is increasingly strained. But if we take a step back and look at the visit more carefully, not through press releases, not through domestic political messaging, but through a strategic lens, the picture becomes far more complicated. Let's start with the economic results, because that's where most of the attention has been focused. One of the headline outcomes of the trip was a Chinese consumer toy company deciding to set up its European headquarters in London, along with plans to open several retail stores across the UK. British officials highlighted the fact that this could create around 150 new jobs. There were also announcements about future export deals, market access arrangements spread over several years, and the possibility of additional Chinese investment into the UK economy. Now, none of this is meaningless. Jobs matter. Investment matters. In an era of sluggish growth, every opportunity counts. But we also need to be honest about scale. This was a prime ministerial visit, a full state-level engagement involving days of meetings, dozens of accompanying executives, and significant diplomatic capital. In that context, the economic outcomes were modest. They were incremental, not transformative. They don't fundamentally change Britain's growth trajectory, its productivity challenges, or its long-term competitiveness. And this isn't a criticism of any single company or deal. It's about proportionality. When governments describe limited, routine commercial activity as a major strategic breakthrough, it raises an important question. Are we measuring success realistically or politically? That question matters because it points to a deeper issue: the gap between diplomatic rhetoric and structural reality. From China's perspective, welcoming European leaders right now serves several purposes. China's economy is under pressure. Growth is slower. Confidence is fragile. Beijing wants to signal stability, openness, and international relevance. High-profile visits from European leaders help project the image that China is not isolated, that it remains an indispensable global partner. From the European side, including the UK, these visits offer something different. They provide limited economic upside, yes, but more importantly, they allow European governments to show domestic audiences that they are engaged globally, that they are pragmatic, and that they can maintain working relationships with all major powers. In other words, both sides get something, but what they get is not symmetrical, and it's certainly not strategic alignment. This is where I think a lot of commentary goes wrong, especially in more emotional or nationalistic narratives. There's an assumption that improved economic ties automatically imply political or strategic convergence. That assumption doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Europe's relationship with China is transactional, cautious, and bounded. Economic engagement exists alongside deep mistrust in areas like technology, security, and values. That tension is not accidental, it's structural. And that brings us to the issue of security. Shortly after leaving China, Prime Minister Starmer traveled to Japan and reaffirmed commitments to closer cooperation on security and defense-related issues in the Indo-Pacific. Some commentators framed this as hypocrisy or betrayal, as if economic engagement with China should automatically preclude security alignment with Japan and the United States. But that framing misunderstands how modern diplomacy actually works. For most advanced economies today, foreign policy operates on multiple tracks at the same time. Countries trade with partners they don't trust. They cooperate economically with rivals. They compartmentalize. Germany does this. South Korea does this. Japan does this. And yes, the UK does this too. Economic cooperation with China does not override Britain's position within NATO, nor does it replace its security partnership with the United States and its allies in Asia. These relationships are not interchangeable. They operate on entirely different foundations. The UK's security alignment is anchored in institutions, intelligence sharing networks, military interoperability, and decades of shared doctrine. China does not offer, and realistically cannot offer, an alternative framework that would replace that system. This is why talk of Europe pivoting toward China or forming a true strategic partnership with Beijing is largely a misunderstanding. Sometimes sincere, sometimes deliberately exaggerated for domestic consumption. European leaders may speak of comprehensive partnerships and long-term cooperation, but those phrases are diplomatic language. They are not commitments to shared security objectives or geopolitical alignment. And here's the key point. European governments know this, and so does China. Beijing understands that Europe is not going to abandon the United States, just as Washington understands that Europe will continue to trade with China. The real contest is not about forcing exclusive choices. It's about shaping the margins. China wants Europe to be less hostile, less unified with Washington, more ambivalent. Europe wants economic access without strategic dependency. The result is a careful dance, not a shift in allegiance. When viewed through this lens, visits like Starmer's make more sense. They are not signs of a changing world order. They are signs of a world trying to manage friction. That said, there is still a legitimate critique to be made, not about betrayal, but about expectations. If political leaders present limited economic engagement as historic breakthroughs, they risk overpromising and underdelivering. Public trust suffers when reality fails to match rhetoric. And internationally, credibility matters. There is also a risk, particularly for smaller or mid-sized economies, of mistaking access for leverage. Market access, granted in controlled increments, is not the same as structural reform. Investment promises are not the same as long-term integration. China remains selective about what it opens and what it protects. Key sectors, energy, finance, strategic technology, are still tightly controlled. That is unlikely to change, regardless of how many delegations visit Beijing. So the real question is not whether dialogue should happen, it should, but whether governments are clear-eyed about what dialogue can realistically achieve. At the global level, the larger context remains unchanged. The defining geopolitical dynamic of our time is still competition between the United States and China. Europe operates within that space, but it does not define it. European countries can influence tone, slow escalation, and create economic buffers, but they cannot rewrite the underlying structure. For China, Europe is economically useful and diplomatically valuable, but not a substitute for the American market or American power. For Europe, China is a major trading partner, but also a systemic rival. These realities coexist even when leaders prefer softer language. And for audiences watching from the outside, especially in the United States, it's important not to overinterpret symbolic gestures. Diplomatic visits make headlines, but power shifts happen through institutions, alliances, technology, and long-term economic fundamentals. So when we evaluate trips like Prime Minister Starmer's visit to China, the most reasonable conclusion is neither celebration nor condemnation. It was a pragmatic visit with limited economic outcomes, modest diplomatic value, and no meaningful change to the strategic balance. That may sound underwhelming, but in today's world, stability itself is sometimes the objective. The danger lies not in engagement, but in illusion. When engagement is framed as something it is not, a strategic breakthrough, a realignment, a turning point, it distorts public understanding. Clear-eyed realism doesn't make for dramatic headlines, but it does make for better policy, and that, ultimately, is what matters. Thanks for watching.